Welcome back. You're watching Future News. We're now joined by Mouafac Harb, journalist and political commentator. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, let's start by looking at Syria. There was a referendum that took place yesterday. I'm sure you're all aware. I mean, do you think that we can move forward with this, or is this going to have a serious effect on Syria?
I don't think anyone was expecting the referendum to end the conflict in Syria. I don't think even the regime is expecting that this referendum will end the crisis. Everyone expected the opposition to reject the referendum. The circumstances under which the referendum took place were not serious ones. The referendum has a credibility problem in the international community, mainly the Western Bloc. However, the regime wanted something out of this referendum to show and to provide those who are defending the regime in the international community, and mainly the United Nations Security Council resolution, and we're talking about Russia and China, that the regime is serious about bringing about some sort of reform. So this is for international consumption to provide Syria's friend, the regime allies, with some arguments that Bashar al-Assad is trying to reform the country. But I don't think I don't think even the regime was expecting that this referendum, no matter what the results, no matter what the percentage is, would end the conflict in Syria.
Well then, I mean, since we've just touched on China and Russia, I mean, we've got the UN Human Rights Council meeting today. They're meeting until March 23rd. And, I mean, they're looking to probably put some international pressure on Assad, of course, to stop the violations. But can they actually do something, or do we need Russia and China's backing?
Unfortunately, this is the international system. You know, if you don't have a United Nations Security Council resolution that is binding, there's nothing you can do in terms of enforcing sanctions. And if you don't have international sanctions, sanctions are usually partial, do not work. You need international sanctions like those who the Security Council resolution, like those that the Security Council passed when during the Libyan conflict.
I mean, the EU just passed today, though.
And the absence of United Nations Security Council resolutions, there is nothing you can impose that has the international legitimacy and like the ones that took place during the Libyan conflict that provided the pretext for NATO to bomb and finish off Gaddafi. So you need the Russian approval. You need them at least to abstain. You need a Security Council resolution so you can move forward. And it seems like Russia is taking a tough stand.
So I mean, no matter what conversations come out of this UN meeting, the Human Rights Council,
it will make the Russian case more difficult to make. So it will. This is how diplomacy works in the United Nations. Whether if the Western Bloc wanted to isolate the Russians, or the Russians sometimes wanted to corner the Western Bloc, they usually provide as much as pressure as possible. So any decision that you make that the international community doesn't like, you have to defend it. You have to put more effort to convince the world. So the Russians would not feel at ease every time to use a veto to defend Syria. So, and in this regard, yes, these kind of pressure may help. It will make the Russian or the Chinese argument in the Security Council meetings more difficult to make, but it's not enough.
Well, you know how you just touched on Libya, telling me that we needed the UN Security Council resolution in order to go in on the ground. I mean, you now have Arab and Western countries talking about arming the rebels.
I think Washington discounted this. I think U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton kind of played down the fact that, the Western world or the Arab world would come and provide weapons to the Syrian opposition. First of all, we don't know the size of the so-called Syrian Free Syria army. And is it real army? Is it, what is the size of the troops? Would arming the opposition play into the hand of the regime? The battlefield is the main advantage that the regime has right now. So if you have an armed opposition, a real army fighting the Syrian army, then you have a conflict whereby you have two equal sides, and this is what the Russians are trying to say at the Security Council. I don't think it would help the opposition at this moment, but you need to come up with something to end at least the suffering of the Syrian and the killing of the civilians on the ground.
At the moment.
I think it's a conflict. It's not a crisis. It's a conflict, and the absence of a major event in Syria. I don't see a scenario whereby a quick solution would end the conflict in Syria. We're going to be there for a while, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. Talking about negotiations.
I know you have now an envoy, Kofi Annan. So the international diplomacy has to produce some sort of an initiative. When you can do something immediately to end the suffering, you need to come up with a process, keep the process alive. And I think right now, they tried the Security Council, it didn't work. They tried Arab sanctions, it didn't work. So now you create a new process, which is a joint venture between the Arab League and the United Nations, which is Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan probably the Syrian regime likes Kofi Annan, they have a good relationship with him, but what's the size of his army? What can he do? What type of leverage you can now have in Syria?
Yeah, what's he got under his belt?
I don't think so. I mean, you need the Security Council to come and vote for a resolution that is binding to all nations.
Well, let's move on to the ground. I mean, currently there's negotiations going on between the ICRC and the Syrian authorities along with the opposition, and they're trying to get into both Hama and Homs to evacuate the wounded. However, I mean, they're hitting stags at both sides, it looks of it, with the Free Syrian Army and the opposition still firing. I mean, how can we get this truce to work?
I mean, I usually stay away from giving an opinion when I don't have like first generation information. I mean, most of the information we are getting from Syria, based on videotapes that are leaked by the opposition. Sometimes we don't know if it's true or not. So it's really difficult to know what's going on in the absence of independent observers, in the absence of independent international organizations that can provide you with the truth. And right now, really, I cannot comment on that. But definitely, what we can say, the number of people that are dying every day in Syria is becoming more...
Just one more comment on this, trying to get the wounded out. They're thinking about opening humanitarian corridors between Lebanon and Jordan, using northern Lebanon and maybe southern Jordan, Daraa. So could this actually bring Jordan and Lebanon into the Syrian crisis deeper?
The issue is when you talk about human corridors, who is going to enforce it? Who is going to protect it? That would get you into military intervention. You need a force to protect those who are distributing the humanitarian funds. And this is what the Turks, the Americans, NATO, and everyone is trying to stay away from, which is to deploy military units to protect any sort of a humanitarian operation. So we can talk about human corridors, but if you cannot enforce it and protect it, no one is going to do it.
No one's going to do it.
And the devil is in the details.
Well, most definitely. Let's just swing it and I'd like to see your thoughts about, just quickly, what effect this Syrian crisis is going to have on Lebanon, could have on Lebanon, or is having.
It's already, I think it's having on Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon is, everyone knows since the Taif Accord, the relationship between Lebanon, it's exceptional. We keep talking about, the relationship between Lebanon and Syria. The late President Hafez said Syria and Lebanon, it's one nation, two states. So you cannot keep Lebanon from being affected by Syria. Historically, Lebanon is affected by Syria. Whether Syria is prosperous, Lebanon is affected, or Syria is under sanctions. However, right now, I think Lebanon is kind of, wait and see. So you may see some sort of a status quo in Lebanon. But if things were to go out of control in Syria, I cannot but see Lebanon affected by this negatively.
Thank you very much, Mouafac.
Thank you.
Nice to have you today. That was Mouafac Harb, a political commentator and journalist. Still to come. Saleh has formally handed over power to his vice president, the winner of an uncontested campaign. This and more after the break.